Thursday, and I apologize for not sending a video out yesterday, Wednesday, for my Wednesday wandering. But I'm going to tell you the truth, I'm really struggling with that. I set my camera up and wandered around in front of it for a while, and I'm just not very good at small talk, and so I could not figure out what I needed to say. So it's been really bothering me that I'm not, that my Wednesday class is on hold for now, and not being able to teach the Bible in that sense, in the way of a classroom, is proving to be a little challenging for me, just to keep my spirits up in some ways. Just so you know, every once in a while the video may flicker because I've had to deal with the dog or something, so I've stopped the video and then I'll restart it. I'm hoping that won't happen too often. She knows I'm working, and so I'm hoping she'll be quiet, as she knows she should be. She's playing with a stick right now, so we'll find out how well she can remember that I'm working at the moment. Well, what I wanted to do today is start, and I'm going to try to do this every week, and again, if I fail one week, please forgive me. But I'm going to try to get a lesson out every week. I don't know how long this lesson will last, as far as time-wise, how long this video will be. But hopefully it won't be too long so that you lose interest, but long enough that you find what I have to say about what I'm going to do interesting. What I want to do is, over the next few weeks, I want to look at the book of Judges out of our Hebrew text. It is right after Joshua, so you have your Torah, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, followed very closely by Joshua, and then Judges, and then Ruth in our Christian layout of the Bible, of our Hebrew and our Christian text. So I want to talk a little bit about the book of Judges. So I'm going to start off with Joshua has led the 12 tribes of Israel out of bondage after Moses led them out of bondage and brought them to the edge of the promised land, and then he passed the mantle on to Joshua, and Moses then goes off and God takes care of Moses, where the text is relatively unclear about what happens to Moses, but he disappears from the story, and God takes care of him. And he passes the mantle of leadership on to Joshua through God's blessing of this, that Joshua has been established all along as Moses' successor as far as the leadership of the tribes, when it comes to moving them into the promised land. And that's what Joshua does. He moves them into the promised land, and for many years they fight skirmishes and take out towns and kind of lay a beachhead, and establish a base of where they can move forward in their conquest territories. And so that's kind of where we are. Joshua has given them a beachhead. Joshua is now old. He's 110 years old. He's given his farewell speech. And yet what we find in the story at the end of the book of Joshua is that Joshua doesn't leave a successor. He doesn't name anybody else. He has no second in command. If there is a second in command, it would have been Caleb, his longtime associate and the only other member of the 12 spies that were sent in 40 years earlier. Caleb was the only one other than Joshua says, no, God will take care of this. We just need to trust in God and move into the promised land. And of course the people disagreed and were afraid and listened to the other spies, and they turned around and wandered back off into the desert where Moses led them around for 40 years. And now they're established. Well, so if anybody, it would be Caleb, and we'll find that Caleb actually does show up at the very beginning of the story, and Caleb also becomes a very important. His lineage becomes very important to the people, and we'll discuss all that and see how that works out as we move through the story. So that's kind of where we are in the book of Judges. I want you to know that the word judges only appears in the entire book, only appears one time. And it is not in reference to the human being, but that God is a judge. And so, or is the judge. And so that's just kind of interesting, but it has historically been called the book of Judges because it moves through the tribes of Israel other than the two that are outside the territories. But the rest of the tribes, they move through from south to north in varying degrees of loss or success. And this is just in the first chapter. And so before I give too much of the story away, let's go ahead and we'll look at the first chapter of Judges, beginning with chapter 1, verse 1. And we're going to read through chapter 2, verse 5. That's kind of one whole set of the beginning. That's the prologue to the rest of the book. The rest of chapter 2 all the way up through the end of chapter 16 is the rest of the stories. And then you have an epilogue, which is a final section, which is the last chapter or so of the book of Judges. So Judges chapter 1, verse 1, and I will read through verse 7, and then we'll discuss that. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" The Lord said, "Judah shall go up. I hereby give the land into his hand." Judah said to his brother Simon, "Come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. Then I too will go with you into the territory allotted to you." So Simon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They came upon Adoni-Bezek at Bezek, and fought against him, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued him, and caught him, and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table, as I have done, so God has paid me back. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. Okay, so as the story begins, what we see is that Joshua has died, and no individual has taken his place. There is no second in command under Joshua. He doesn't have a capable leader that's capable of leading the entire tribes, all of the tribes, as one unified leader. They don't have a king. Now Joshua wasn't a king. He was their war leader. He was the war chief. Led them through the first part of this war. But now, now that they're in the promised land, and the land has been allotted off to them, Joshua sat down with a map and said, "Here, this is yours, and here, this is yours. Judah, here's your plot of land, and inside of your plot of land is Simon, your full brother." See, Simon and that's why Judah asked Simon to help him out. When Judah goes in to conquer his land, Simon's land is right in the middle of Judah's land. Simon and Judah are full brothers. They both are the same mother and the same father, so they're full brothers. And so Simon and Judah back each other up. Simon eventually, the tribe of Simon eventually gets absorbed into the tribe of Judah. So there's kind of a tragedy in that, is that individuality of that tribe disappears and is absorbed by the other tribe. But that gives Judah in the south a lot of strength, because there are two tribes, even though Simon was a very small tribe. And just north of Simon is the tribe of Benjamin, but we'll they inquire of God. All of them, the entire Israelite people inquire of God, who shall lead us? And God's response is, the tribe of Judah will be the primary tribe. That's what this really is saying, is that I am designated Judah to be the lead tribe. Out of all of the tribes, Judah is going to be my chief tribe. That's the one that I'm going to demand be the leader tribe, in a sense. And it is eventually from the tribe of Judah that David arises. And then from David, of course, as we move forward in time, eventually we get to the time of Jesus. So, as this begins, God designates Judah to be the leader, and that it is their turn to fight against the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Just so you know, the Canaanites are the majority tribe, and it kind of it designates just about everybody else that lives there. They're all Canaanites in a sense, but there is one chief top tribe, and that's the Canaanites. The Perizzites actually means like the country folk. Is kind of it, and so they're not really a tribe so much as a subclass of group. It's a group of people, and they're the ones that live outside the town walls, outside the city walls. They're the ones that work the farm. That's who the Perizzites are. So they're the country folk. So it's the city folk and the country folk, the leading tribe, the tribal leaders, and that. And so. So Judah and Simon, they team up together, and they agree to fight for each other's land. And they go in, and Judah goes up, and he defeats the Canaanites that live in his territory, and they drive out the Perizzites, the land folk, the country folk also. They all fall into their hands. And near the town of Berek, they defeat Adoni-Berek, which means the king of Berek. They destroy his entire army. Some 10,000 people are killed there, and that's when they run across the king, who is Adoni-Bezek. And now, apparently Adoni-Bezek at Bezek, so he's the king of Bezek. When they run across him, they take him captive. Now maybe they've heard about what this king was like. But this was not an uncommon practice, was to remove both his thumbs and his big toes. That would make him where he, you remove the opposable thumb and he can't grab anything, you remove the big toes, and it becomes incredibly difficult to walk. And so this is kind of how the leadership of Judah treat this king. They remove his thumbs and his toes. Interestingly enough, just for the record, the Hebrew word for thumb and big toe are they're the same word. It just means the big digit, and so it's when it removes the big digit of both the hands and the feet, we translate that as the big toe and the thumb. But in the Hebrew, it's just one word. So anyway, that's just kind of a little side note there. So Judah and and Simon go in and they conquest the territory that belongs to Judah. But along the way, let's see, where does it go here? And so they along the way they also where is that here? Let's see. So they defeat him, they take the town of Bezek, and they pick up the scraps and they've done, and they bring him, what it says here is they brought him to Jerusalem and he died there. But at this moment, as we read through the story, Jerusalem hasn't been conquered. This is the first time that Jerusalem is mentioned here, other than way back in the distant past, where we had Jerusalem mentioned as one of the 5 kings. Interestingly enough, when you go back into that story, I believe it's with the Abraham story, is that when they defeat the kings, Jerusalem is not one of the defeated cities. So Abraham and that whole contingent of warfare that happened during Abraham's time, Jerusalem was not defeated. But here it says they bring him to Jerusalem and he died there. Well, let's read forward and see what's next, and maybe that will explain it to us. Beginning with Judges chapter 1, verse 8. Then the people of Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it. They put it to the sword and set the city on fire. Afterward, the people of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country, in the Negeb, and in the lowland. Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. The name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba. And they defeated Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. So, here we finally get Jerusalem is being mentioned here. And the people of Judah, they fight against Jerusalem, the city. Jerusalem of the, I don't know how the Jerusalem of the time was, but I know what it was like later. In Jerusalem, in a later time, Jerusalem is built on two hills, and on one hill was a threshing floor, on the other was a village. And so you had a village, a small village on one hill, and a threshing floor, or a place to process grain, on the other. And so there was these two hills. And that's kind of how Jerusalem was, and that's how it may have been at the time. But Judah, it appears that Judah goes in and completely wipes out Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem is completely destroyed. But of course, at this time, it's not owned by anybody other than the people the Jerusalemites, the original Canaanites who lived there. In fact, if we go back far enough, you also have the story of Abraham and Melchizedek, where Melchizedek is the priest of Jerusalem. So Judah goes in and conquers Jerusalem, and he puts it to the sword. That means he does a harem. That means everything in the city is wiped out. Every man, woman, child, goat, sheep, dog, everything that lives is killed, and they're not allowed. They're not supposed to let anything escape. And so they completely destroy and level the city of Jerusalem. And then they move on. They leave it. What we need to recognize, too, is that Jerusalem sits on the border between two tribes, the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Judah. It sits right on the border between those two. And so who controls Jerusalem really is dependent on who is stronger between Benjamin and Judah. Judah went through this time and destroys Jerusalem, leaving the hilltop bare. And so Judah didn't find use for that place at this time. So he moves on, and he takes the Canaanites out of the hill country in the Negeb and in the lowlands. So he kind of clears out all of the Canaanites that live in, most of the Canaanites that live in his territory. Judah went against the Canaanites that lived in Hebron. Now Hebron becomes a major town. Hebron was a major city at the time, or a major town at the time. And so he goes against Hebron. And they defeat three. These are three brothers, and as we get further in, the three brothers will their names will come back, or not their names, but an association. Well, we'll get to that anyway. We'll mention them when we get there. So they defeat these three brothers, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. Now, picking up with verse 11. From there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kiriath Sepher. Then Caleb said, "Whoever attacks Kiriath Sepher and takes it, I will give him my daughter Aksah as wife." And Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, and he gave him his daughter Aksah as wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. As she dismounted from her donkey, Caleb said to her, "What do you wish?" She said to him, "Give me a present. Since you have set me in the land of the Negeb, give me also Gulath Mayim." So Caleb gave her Upper Gulath and Lower Gulath. Okay, so now they go against the inhabitants of another town, Debir, and whenever they give us this little, it's always kind of in a parentheses. This parenthetical statement is that the name of the town Debir used to be or was formerly Kiriath Sefer. Every time you see something like that, there'll be several of those. Is that after the town was taken, those towns were not destroyed. Instead, they drove all the people out of them, killed the people, but they left the town intact, and then they renamed the town and take control of it. And so this happens in Hebron, this happens in Debir, and you may see those in the future too, references like that. And so just realize that that's what's happened here. Haram wasn't done, the city wasn't leveled and destroyed, but instead the people were all killed, but they probably kept the farm animals and the dogs and all of those kinds of things, the non-humans. They killed all the humans, and in some cases even enslaved other peoples. And we'll see some of that, but it was not a regular practice, but there was times when that happened. So, they come to Debir, and Caleb shows back up. Now, Caleb himself was, in fact, if you remember, if we go back far enough, the first time we meet Caleb is he's one of the 12 spies that is sent into the Promised Land 40 years earlier, 40 plus years earlier, to help spy out the land. And he's partnered with Joshua. Joshua and Caleb are the team that go into the Promised Land and scout it out along with 10 other spies. So they come to Debir, got a phone call, had a little interruption, so I'm going to pick up where I am. So they get to Debir, and we met Caleb. And Caleb, if we go back, we remember that Caleb was part of he was one of the original spies that went into the Promised Land. I remember saying that already. Okay, so when the 12 spies come back, 10 of the spies says this place is too dangerous for us. We can't go. The people are too big. It's just not possible. We're not strong enough to go in there, and they're frightened. And 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, both say, we need to trust in God. God will lead us through this. God will get us what we need. All we need to do is trust. And so Joshua and Caleb are the only 2 that say 40 plus years earlier, we can do this. They trusted and believed that God was there in their presence and was going to be able to take care of them. So, that's who Caleb is. Now, you'd almost think that Caleb should have been the leader. But God at this moment does not want or did not call for a single leader of all the tribes. Instead, he's leading it up to, and this is what the Judges book is all about, leading it up to each tribe to find the individual leader who will lead that tribe to take their own territory. Judah and Simon teamed up together and took their territory. And from that tribe, the leadership of Caleb steps forward. Caleb, that old warrior from way back, steps forward again. And he's leading the Judah tribes as their warlord. So that's something to keep in mind, that Caleb is leading as their warlord. And what he says is, I will give to whoever takes this city, I will give my daughter's hand in marriage. My daughter Aksa, I will give them married. And so there's a young man named Othniel, and he's the son of Kenaz. Caleb's younger brother took it. So this would be, Othniel is Caleb's cousin. He is his nephew. He's the son of Caleb's younger brother, so that makes him his nephew. So Othniel is his nephew, and so now his nephew is going to marry, or if he wins the battle and he takes the city, then he will be able to claim the bride. So he takes the city and he gives it to, and he gave him his daughter Aksa as his wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. So Aksa goes to Othniel and she persuades him to ask the king, or ask Caleb, okay, you've conquered this whole territory, will you, this section, this part, will you give me a field, a place where my husband and I can establish our farm and live, or our ranch, our sheep farm, whatever it is, our sheep, whatever it is we're going to do, will you give us a field? Will you give us a place where we can do that? And Caleb agrees. And I want you to note here that she leaves her husband to go back to her father to ask for a piece of land, and she's riding on a donkey. I want you that when we get to the end of the book, I want you to we will connect this story to the end of the book. This is a book written in a sandwich form. The prologue at the beginning and the epilogue at the end actually connect. And so part of that connection is a woman leaving her family, part of her family, either coming to or going away from her father on a donkey. And we'll see the other half of this. That's why this is a sandwich story. We'll see the other half of this as we get to the end of Judges. But I want you to kind of recollect or keep in mind, make a note about the donkey, about her riding on a donkey when she dismounts from her donkey. So the first time Othniel went and asked for a plot of land, and he was given a plot of land, and he gave her a field, or gave Othniel a field. Well, apparently this field was dry. There wasn't a water source on this field. So this scene, this next part of this, she arrives riding on a donkey. She dismounts from the donkey, and Caleb asks her, well, what can I do for you? And she asked then, she asked him, so, well, since you gave me this plot of land in the Negev, which is dry, it's kind of a desert area, will you also give me something? Will you give me Gulath Mayim? Now, Gulath Mayim is a water area. Has some water sources, has some streams, and so Caleb gives her, when she comes to him and asks for the gift, he gives her both the lowland and the upper land, and so she has good farmable land, good shepherding land for sheep and goats, or for to farm. And so that's just something to keep in mind at the beginning of this story here. We have, in fact, there are 5 women who show up in the book of Judges, and I'll talk about this as we move through this, but I want you to note as we move through that each woman is treated differently as we move forward. And as the culture breaks down, as the division among the tribes develops, as their inability to conquer the territories they're supposed to, as they assimilate the cultures of those around them instead of rejecting that culture, the state of women in the story gets worse. At the beginning of the story, gifts are given. Love is shown. respect is shown to the daughter, to the wife, to the woman, to the female in the story. But as we move forward, we find after the first couple that the state of women falls into worse and worse states. And so we'll see that, and I want you to take note of that now that I said it, because as we move forward, you'll see it. Picking up now with verse 16. The descendants of Hobab the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negeb near Arad. Then they went and settled with the Amalekites. Judah went with his brother Simon, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath, and devoted it to destruction. So the city was called Hormah. Judah took Gaza with its territory, Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. The Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had chariots of iron. Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the 3 sons of Anak. But the Benjamites did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived in Jerusalem among the Benjamites to this day. Okay, there's a little confusion in this, but I'll explain it as best I can. This is the third name of Moses' father-in-law. He's known as Jethro, and here the descendants of Hobab the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negeb near Arad. So apparently Moses' father-in-law has finally followed along, and the Kenites settle among or near into the wilderness areas of Judah. They settle into the territorial lands of Judah, is where the descendants of Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, Hobab, I don't know why he has a different name, they settle in the territories, and that's just kind of here's a little side note, kind of little note here. Here's where they settle, and then they went and settled with the Amalekites. Now that's not good, to settle with one of the tribes that is not supposed to be living there. So we'll see how that turns out. Judah went with his brother Simon, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Ziphath, and devoted it to destruction. That means that they did the haram there. They completely leveled the city. They killed every living thing in the place, and burned it to the ground. Total destruction. So the city was called Hormah. That's an interesting. Hormah is a derivative from the Hebrew word for haram, for that total destruction. So it's just a derivative of that original word that I mentioned earlier, of the harem. Judah then takes Gaza with its territory, Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. Now, what's interesting is that those are 3 cities, and they have surrounding territories. What is interesting is that Judah later loses these territories to the Philistines. And these 3 cities, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashkelon, all become major Philistine cities, which David later has to deal with. But we'll get to that way off in 2 Samuel, or 1 Samuel. It's in both. But anyway, well, I guess it's in 1 Samuel. Anyway, So Judah takes these territories and they become part of the Judah territory, the Judah land. Let's see. And Simon, who is with Judah, takes possession of the hill country that belongs to him, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain. Now, Judah seems to be faltering here, failing here. Hebron, now it says because they had chariots of iron. Now this is highly disputed that the chariot was completely made of iron. It was most likely that it had iron-clad wheels. A completely iron chariot would be way too heavy to be pulled by horses. So it probably had iron-clad wheels, if anything. Iron was still one of those very precious commodities. To make it a completely iron chariot would be a waste of iron. So, Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out the 3 sons of Anak. Remember those 3 I mentioned earlier, the 3 that they mentioned back here in verse 10. They defeated Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. That was the 3. That was the 3 brothers that they just mentioned here. He drove out the 3 sons of Anak. Interestingly enough, again, there's a little side note. If we were to follow Anak back, Anak is mentioned way back in the book of Numbers, being associated with the Nephilim, which were too powerful for the people. And so it frightened the people of Israel. So Anak is a descendant of those very large people known as the Nephilim, the heroes of the old. It's kind of a little interesting connection here. But Judah is able to defeat those 3. But, now here's where we get maybe a little bit of confusion. But the Benjamites did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived in Jerusalem among the Benjamites to this day. I guess the confusion, of course, is that didn't Judah just destroy, completely harem, Jerusalem? And now here all of a sudden the Jebusites live there, and Benjamin can't root them out. He can't defeat them. What's going on? Well, apparently a period of time has elapsed since when Jerusalem, remember, more battles have been fought and so forth. Benjamin must have been sitting on his thumbs all this time and not moving forward with his conquest of his territory, or he took a long time to get back around to Jerusalem. But another tribe of peoples, the Jebusites, kind of took the territory that was Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, and rebuilt it, put in fortifications, and were able to keep the Benjamites out. And so the city of Jerusalem now, from this point, although it's still referenced as Jerusalem quite frequently, it is now really, its really name is Jebus. And the Jebusites live in Jebus, Jerusalem. The other thing is that it says that they lived in Jerusalem among the Benjamites to this day. That means that when this story was written was prior to David's conquering of Jebus, turning it back into Jerusalem. So it was written prior to that, but because the city hadn't been taken over yet. So that kind of gives you a time frame. It was before David that they actually wrote these stories down. Part of the tradition is that maybe Samuel had written these stories, but I'm skeptical of that, and most scholars are. So anyway, that kind of explains that here, is that during that lapsed time after Judah conquered Jerusalem, the Jebusites moved up onto that hilltop and rebuilt fortification, built a citadel up there, a fortress. And then the Jebusites had Jebus on one hill and the threshing floor on the other. And the threshing floor becomes very important later on, but we'll get to that also someday in the distant future. So, picking up now again with verse 22. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph sent out spies to Bethel. The name of the city was formerly Luz. When the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, "Show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you." So he showed them the way into the city, and they put the city to the sword. But they let the man and all his family go. So the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city, and named it Luz. That is its name to this day. Now, so I'll explain here. Okay, so now the house of Joseph, of course, is his two sons, Manasseh and Naphtali. Naphtali. So we have Manasseh and Naphtali. Both Manasseh and Naphtali are the sons of Joseph, and if you remember, they were presented to Jacob, and he did this kind of number on them, and they received land, the Joseph land. The land that would have gone to Joseph goes to his two sons, because Joseph stayed in Egypt. And so his two sons, Naphtali and Manasseh, they go in to try to take their territory, their land, that's been allotted to them. And in their territory is the town of Bethel. And the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph went out, sent out spies to Bethel. And now here's where again, parenthetical note, the name of the town was Luz, but after Naphtali and Manasseh conquered it, the town changes its name to Bethel. But it originally was Luz. Now that is important to the story, because here is the failure of Joseph. The spies that they send out, they see a man coming out of the village, or out of the town of Bethel, or out of the town of Luz, and they grab a hold of him, they question him, and on the promise that they would treat him very nicely, that kindly they would let him go, he tells them how to get into the city. So they conquer the city, and they were supposed to kill every living thing that belonged to that city. But he let that family go. The family goes into Hittite territory, yet to be conquered, and establishes a new city called Luz, just like the old city, and reestablishes the same thing in a different place. And so that's kind of a failure of Joseph, because of the Joseph clan of Manasseh and Naphtali. By allowing this man to go, he reestablishes the exact same worship, the same everything, in a new town that he names after the old town, which still existed at the time of the writing. And it becomes a thorn in the side later. And again, that's a future story. Now, verse 27. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Eblim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, but the Canaanites continued to live in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not, in fact, drive them out. Okay, so as we're moving up, we hear now, here is Manasseh. He failed to drive them out of, and they give this whole list of villages that he was unable to conquer. In fact, what he finally ends up doing is he finally just kind of lives with the Canaanites that live there. And this is wrong, according to what their charge is. The charge is, I don't want to get into the moralities of wiping out whole towns or any of that kind of stuff. That is a whole different subject and a different direction that I'm interested in talking about. I'm going to give you the story and talk about it as it is, not as we wish it should be or how it should have been. So he's not able to take those places, and so they settled among the Canaanites there. Ephraim also doesn't drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. This is verse 29. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, but the Canaanites lived among them in Gezer. And again, now here's a town where the Canaanites and the Israelites started living together, the children or the sons of Ephraim. So, moving on then, Zebulun, and just so you realize this, we're moving up north. We started in the south in Judah, and we moved, skipping over Benjamin. Well, actually, we did have Benjamin. They weren't able to take out Jerusalem. So we have Judah and Simon way in the south, and Benjamin is the next tribe north. And as we move north, then you have the two tribes of Joseph, and then you move forward north further. You have Ephraim, and now even further north, you have Zebulun. And in verse 30, Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Nehalol, but the Canaanites lived among them and become subject to forced labor. So here Zebulun does not conquer or drive the people out as they're supposed to, but instead they live among them and enslave some of them. Zebulun also isn't living according to the rules, according to how God has established for them that they're supposed to be. Verse 31. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Alab, or of Akzib, or of Helba, or of Aphek, or of Rehob. But the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. And again, the tribe of Asher just settles in. They couldn't drive them out, so they just settled in among them. Again, living with them. The danger in this is that they will start being assimilated by the larger. So they'll start picking up and start doing things the way the Canaanites do it, instead of the way that the Israelites do it. Instead of the way they've been taught by God on how they're supposed to be, instead they'll start being more Canaanite than Israelite. And that's not what God wants. They'll start worshiping the gods of the Canaanites. They'll start thinking as themselves as being part of this place, and this is how they're, and so it'll change them. And that's not what God wants for them. God wants them to worship only Yahweh, only Adonai, and not these other gods. Verse 33. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anan, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and of Beth Anath became subject to forced labor for them. And again, Naphtali does the same thing. They're not able to defeat them, so they live among them and enslave part of them, put them into forced labor. Verse 34. The Amorites pressed the Danites back into the hill country. They did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites continued to live in Haharez, in Ajalon, in Shaalbim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they become subject to forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah, and upward. The Danites, the tribe of Dan, is the northernmost tribe. Once you get past the Danites, once you get past the tribes of Dan, you moving on into Syria, Syrian territory. So the Amorites were, at the time, were a very powerful northern tribe, and as much as Dan tried to move into the plains or into the lower lands, they kept being pushed back into the hill country, and they didn't allow them to come down into the plains. And the plains is where you could grow your grain and stuff. And so Dan was not allowed, was kept out of its territory. Verse 35, the Amorites continued to live in Harez and Ajalon, in these places. And the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. So again, those that came back into contact with the tribes of Joseph, those two sub-tribes of Joseph, they were again put into forced labor. Those that weren't able to, they were just put into forced labor, again, put into slavery. But, and again, the border that the Amorites had was just pretty much maintained, and Dan did not make any headway into that. Chapter 2, and we're going to read only this first 5 verses of chapter 2, and then I will close our session for today. So, beginning with chapter 2, verse 1. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and said, I brought you up from Egypt, and I brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done. So now, I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. So, after all these failures, all the way from Benjamin, Judah's okay, but from Benjamin north, they just failure after failure after failure. After all of this, and they've just kind of settled in with the Canaanites without fighting them anymore, God sends an angel to speak to them, and he goes from Gilgal till Bochim. That's from the southern territory all the way up to the northern. I mean, just he travels through all of this, speaking to all of the people of Israel, and he says to them, "I brought you up out of Egypt." Now remember, excuse me. You remember, angels speak for God. Angels are the voice of God. That's what angel is, a messenger of God and bringing God's word into the world. And so the angel speaks and says, God speaks, and the angel brings out this message. I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars. That was the command, that I will be your God, and you will not obey or worship or be part of any other type of belief system. You will believe in me, you will follow me, I will be your God, and I will take care of you. That's part of our covenant. As long as I'm your God, and you don't look and you pay attention to what I have to say, and you do what I ask you to do, I'll take care of you. I'll make sure that my promise to you is fulfilled. But you disobeyed. You didn't follow the rules. You didn't obey my commands. You didn't do what we promised each other we would do. In fact, I want you to see what you have done. And see what you've done. You've broken our covenant. You've broken our relationship. And so I'm going to make this harder for you. I am going to make this harder for you. Now you, without my guidance, you are going to have to push out the enemies that are among you. You are going to have to stand up to their gods. You are going to have to, because they're going to be a snare to you. They're going to try to trap you into their religion. They're going to try to trap you into their belief and try to do things their way when I want you to do them my way. Well, after the angel spoke these words to the Israelites, they all wept. They named that place Bochim. From happiness to weeping, from joy to weeping. from Gilgal to Bochim, from joy to weeping. Here they named the place Bochim because this is where they weep before the Lord, before God. They sacrifice to God. They sacrifice to Adonai after the message is given. But by the time they make that sacrifice, it's too late. God has made a judgment, and God's judgment must be carried out. And so God, as their judge, His judgment must be carried out. So they named the place Bochim. And again, I want you, this is a note that I want you to put, that the story, the end of the prologue is the people are weeping. Well, that is the end of the class for today. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of this. I really look forward to any feedback you might want to give me. Next week we'll pick up with chapter 2, verse 6, and I'm not sure where we'll go. I'll figure it out, and I'll let you know next week as to what you look at. But at least read, if you want to read ahead, at least read chapter 2, at least read chapter 2, and that's probably where I'll do is next week. I will do chapter 2, verses 6 through the end of the chapter, which is 23. So, my blessings to you, and as I tell my class each week as we close our class, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. The response to that is supposed to be, thanks be to God. Now, my class, very few of them ever do that, and so I don't expect you to either. But those are the words that I close my class with. And so once again, I will say this to you: go in peace to love and serve the Lord.